In this video, I am going to cover Atari 5200 emulation setup in Retroarch. The Atari 5200 is such an interesting console, and one that I don't have the most experience with, but still rather enjoy. That being said, using the original hardware can be kind of interesting in this day and age, so I have just honestly moved on to emulating the system entirely. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to get that set up on the PC version of Retroarch. So let's dive in. So the first thing you're going to need to start emulating Atari 5200 games on the PC version of Retroarch is to install the PC version of Retroarch. This video is a continuation of my how to install Retroarch PC videos, so look in the description or upper right hand corner of the screen for a link on how to get to this video, get Retroarch set up with a number of extra steps included for better video and generally pretty good setup steps. Once you have Retroarch up and running, the next thing we need are Atari 5200 games. By the time you're watching this video, I will have uploaded a video on how to get a selection of Atari 5200 games from the Atari Vault Steam game. So that is just one method of getting Atari 5200 games. If you have a physical collection, hardware dumpers exist out there. Or, you could always resort to the shady parts of the net. I don't give a crap which way you do it. Don't ask for download links though, because none will be provided, and comments like that will be deleted so fast. Just don't do it. But once you have your games sourced, you just need to put them anywhere you want on your computer. It doesn't frickin' matter where they go. Put them on your desktop, put them in your C drive, put them in your D drive. It doesn't matter. For my tutorial purposes, I made a Retroarch games folder inside my Retroarch PC tutorial folder, and that's just where I'm going to put my Atari 5200 games for now. Now, go in there. Alright. Now, the last prerequisite we need is an Atari 5200 BIOS file, and as with the Atari 5200 games I just mentioned, I do have a video up on the channel now showing you how to get a legal copy of an Atari 5200 BIOS file from the Atari Vault game. If you don't want to source it that way, you could do crazy hardware dumpers or, resort to the shady part of the net again, but as always, no download links will be provided, so stop asking! But once you have this file sourced, it does need to be named 5200.rom in order to work. Once you have this file and you have it named correctly, we just need to put it into our Retroarch system folder. So open up your Retroarch folder, go down to System, and dump the 5200 ROM file in there. And with that, we're good to load up Retroarch and download the Atari 5200 core. Now, just as a quick note, I do recommend placing your Atari 5200 BIOS file before trying to load the Atari 800 core, because if you do it in an opposite order, it will break things. The games won't work, it won't find the BIOS file right, so if that ends up happening, you just need to go into the config folder. Let me show you a quick example here. So if you end up launching the Atari 800 core before you put the BIOS file, you could go into config and then delete the one that says Atari 800 and start over from scratch after placing the BIOS file, and you should be good to go. Back to where we were. Once Retroarch is up and running, just go into the online updater, core downloader, and then just scroll down to Atari, and we are looking for Atari 5200 Atari 800 core. Press enter on this to download it. And once it's downloaded, we just need to get it set up to play Atari 5200 games. So we're just going to back out to the main menu here. Now from here, go to load content, and navigate to the directory you have your Atari 5200 games stored in. So for me, in my example, I had them on the desktop, so C, users, user profile, desktop, Retroarch, Retroarch games, Atari 5200 games, and here's my Atari 5200 game selection. So I'm just going to load up Asteroids real quick. Gonna tell it to load up in Atari 5200, and as you can see, it's just kind of sitting here at a black screen not doing anything. This is normal. This is kind of what happens when you load up Atari 5200 for the first time. So what we need to do now is press F1 on our keyboard to go into the Retroarch quick menu, scroll down to options, and we need to change the Atari system from a 400/800 OSB over to an Atari 5200. So just press enter on this, and then scroll down to auto-detect A5200 cart type and turn it on. Once you have these options set, it should automatically boot your games. If it doesn't, as you can see on my example here, it didn't. This is perfectly normal. We just need to back out, close the content, and then we could go over to our history tab and just reload it. And this time it loads right up as expected. Now, I personally do not like having to go into the load content tab every time I want to load up an Atari 5200 game, so I'm going to show you a nice way to make a games playlist so that way you can easily access all of your Atari 5200 games. My preferred method for doing this on PC is to press F5 on your keyboard to go to the Retroarch desktop menu. Once the desktop menu loads up, it might bring up a little thing here saying, hey, welcome to the desktop menu, so you could just say, hey, get out of my face, it's all good. But over on the left-hand side here is a playlist and file browser content browser thing. So right-click wherever there's space, new playlist, type in Atari, space 5200, and press enter. And that will give us a nice little Atari 5200 playlist entry here on the left. And now in this main box, all we need to do is right-click, add folder, navigate to the directory that we have our Atari 5200 games in, select the folder, tell it the core is Atari 800, tell it the database is Atari 5200, and then press OK. And it should bring up every single Atari 5200 game you have in that folder. And another great thing about the desktop menu is it will show you if you have the BIOS file that you need and it is being detected correctly, if it shows up in green here. If it doesn't show up in green, it's not being detected properly. Little troubleshooting tip. Now, one last little optional step for the playlist creation here. If you want to have box arts make it look a little bit nicer within Retroarch, you can right-click on the Atari 5200 entry here and tell it to download all thumbnails for this playlist. Now, it is looking for games to be named in a specific way, so it's usually the game name followed by a region code, and that is what it's looking for in the database, and if it finds them, it'll add them. If it doesn't, it'll say it's failed. So, for example, it didn't find quite a bit of mine, interestingly enough. So what I like to do in this case is look up the box art for that game. Sometimes it's as simple as a Google search, but for example here, Asteroids on Atari 5200. There's a fairly decent looking box art for it. It'll look good once we're in Retroarch itself, so just gonna go ahead and save it to my desktop. Now all I need to do to add this to my Retroarch playlist is to make sure it is in .png format. Mine is in JPEG, so I just need to convert it over. So on Windows, this can be as simple as just right-clicking on it, clicking on Edit, opening it up in Paint, saving it again as a .png file. There we go. So now I have one in .png that I can use in my desktop menu. So I'm just going to select the desktop menu, make sure I have Asteroids selected, and then I'm just going to drag the box art into the box art window here, and it will apply it to the game. So now I have box art for Asteroids. And then you can do this with every single Atari 5200 game that doesn't happen to find box art automatically. I'm not going to bother with this right now, but that is the process for those of you that want to get those playlists looking really pretty very easily. But once you have the playlist set up the way you want, you can just go ahead and close out of the desktop menu. Click on Retroarch, press F to bring it back into full screen, and all we need to do now is restart Retroarch to get that Atari 5200 games playlist to show up here on the left. So just click on Restart Retroarch. And once Retroarch has rebooted, there is our new Atari 5200 playlist entry on the left, and then we have our games with box arts if we bothered to include them. And then to run a game, all you need to do is click on it and click on Run, and it will pop right up. Now let's go ahead and talk about controls for a minute, because when you first load up an Atari 5200 game, you may notice that you can't actually play it. So one of the first things I like to do is plug a controller into my PC to use with Retroarch. So I have my Xbox One controller here. So plug it in, it's automatically detected, but guess what? I still can't actually play or do anything with it yet. So to fix this, you need to press F1 on your keyboard to open up the Retroarch quick menu. Now from here, scroll down to Controls and go into Port 1 Controls. And we need to change our device type from RetroPad to an Atari joystick. And this will finally let us start playing games. And controls are pretty straightforward for this core. You've got your D-pad set to move direction arrows. B and Y are your main fire buttons. A is return. X is Y. And then start and back or start and select. Left bumper is options. Right bumper brings you into the Atari 800 menu. Left trigger is space. Right trigger is escape. And then left thumbstick, when you click down on it, is a virtual keyboard. And then right thumb button set to R3. I don't think that really does anything. But going back into our game, if it brings up the Atari 800 emulator menu here, just press escape on your keyboard once. Don't press it again, otherwise it'll quit Retroarch entirely. But now we can press start on our controller and begin to play our games. One more quick note on controls, star and pound are not mapped to anything on your controller, so you do need to click in on your left thumbstick to bring up the virtual keyboard so you can use these keys. And this lets you set options for different games or multiplayer for some. And then you can just click on the thumbstick again to close it down. And another thing to note about Atari 5200 is it doesn't have proper analog input like the Atari 5200 does, so playing games like Breakout is a little bit difficult. They're supposed to work with a mouse, but I have not been able to ever get this to work within Retroarch, so not sure how to get the mouse input to work here. I'll report back to you when I figure it out with an updated video. So for those of you looking to get Atari 800 games up and running, that is the process, and make sure you do it in that order. Make sure you place that BIOS file before trying to run the core, otherwise you will have to delete the config file and start over from scratch. And then also be sure to set that controller option to an Atari joystick, otherwise you will just not be playing anything at all. But now let's go ahead and cover some of the more advanced core options available to us within the Atari 800 core. Not a lot here specific to Atari 5200, so it won't take very long. But pressing F1 on our keyboard brings us back into the Retroarch quick menu. This time go down to Options. Now the first option is to choose the Atari system that we went over earlier. You need to set this to Atari 5200, otherwise you just aren't going to be playing Atari 5200 games. Next is our video standard, and you can change this between NTSC and PAL. Next we have a number of Atari 8-bit computer specific options, so we're just going to skip all those for now, and go right down to high-res artifacting. And this is a fun little accuracy option for those of you that grew up with an Atari 5200, and it kind of simulates some of the noise you'd get from the Atari 800 signal. So going back into the emulator here, you can now see that my video is a little bit more noisy, there's graphical glitches going on, and that's just kind of reminiscent to what it looked like to play these games back on an old CRT. It's just a fun little option for those of you that grew up with it. The next option was the auto detect Atari 5200 cart type, definitely recommend having this on. And then we have a joy hack for Atari 5200 Robotron, so if you play Robotron, I definitely recommend turning this on. If you don't, you can just leave it off. And then next up we have internal resolution. I don't recommend messing with this because it does break things. When you try to change the resolutions, it just results in a bunch of garbage data. Even when restarting the content and turning it back on, it just doesn't show up correctly unless you're on the 336 by 240 option. And then the last option is another one for the Atari 8-bit computers, so really has no bearing on the Atari 5200. But that's going to do it as far as core options are concerned. So if you have options that you want to set on a per game basis, you could do that here with the Manage Core Options feature, and you could save it as a game options file. That way every time you load up that game, those are the options that will greet you. Very useful if you want to play both Atari 8-bit computer games and 5200 games under Retroarch. Atari 5200 games and 8-bit computer games require different BIOS files, and so you can set which system you're playing on and all that stuff, so the per game options are going to be your best bet there. If you don't plan on using any of the Atari 8-bit computer options with Retroarch, you could also save everything as a core override, so that way every time you load up the core, these are the options that will greet you. And to do this, you back out of the options menu, scroll down to overrides, and save them as a core override. But that's going to do it as far as Atari 5200 emulation is concerned. Again, this one can be complicated just because you need to do it in that specific order. If you do it out of order, it can break it, and then you need to delete the config file and relaunch it after the BIOS file is placed, and it should be good to go. As always, if you happen to have any questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below, and I will do my best to try to help you out. But now if you could all do me a huge favor, and be sure to hit that like or dislike button, just depending on how much you like today's video. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit that sub button so you can see when new videos kind of like this, or reviews and other nonsense I like to post, goes live. Really goes a long way to helping out the channel, and I'm just so grateful to all of you for that. If you'd like to further help support the channel, you could also check out that join button here on YouTube, or the Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. A little really does go a long way to keeping this place up and running, and just a huge shout out to all of our champions who have kept this place going. Just Thank you all so much. You are amazing. We appreciate you all so much. Thank you. But that's going to do it for this one. So until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, stay awesome, and we will see you all back next video.